You may remember Ronald Reagan calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. You may remember Fidel Castro on the evening news. You may remember the years when the Cold War felt less like a political argument and more like a fuse burning slowly towards something no one could stop. But there was another Cold War battlefield, far from Europe, far from Berlin, far from the missile silos and television studios Americans knew so well. It was in southern Africa. Between the mid-1970s and the late 1980s, Angola became one of the hottest and least remembered ground wars of the Cold War. Cuban troops crossed the Atlantic by the tens of thousands. Soviet weapons arrived by ship and aircraft. East German advisors worked quietly behind the lines. American money moved through covert channels, then stopped. South Africa fought secretly, then openly, then secretly again. And in the middle of that war was a vehicle that looked too small to matter. 6 tons, 4 wheels, a thin steel hull, no stabilizer, no laser range finder, no real protection against a modern tank gun. It was based on a French armored car originally designed for colonial policing and reconnaissance. It was not supposed to win tank battles. And yet, in Angola, it did. This is the story of the Eland. The little armored car South African cruise nicknamed the Naughty Car because its turret rocked backward when it fired, like the head of a toy. A machine born from isolation. A machine built under the shadow of sanctions. A machine that became a symbol of both remarkable engineering and a deeply troubled history. And the story begins on a dusty riverbank in Angola in 1975. Central Angola. The dry season has hardened the ground into red dust. The roads are not really roads. They are tracks cut through bush, riverbeds, and abandoned colonial settlements. A small armored car rolls forward and stops near a river crossing. Inside are 3 South African soldiers. Most crews in these vehicles are young, some are barely out of school. Many are national servicemen, trained quickly, sent north into a war their government does not publicly admit is being fought. The vehicle around them is an Eland 90. It weighs roughly 6 tons, lighter than many trucks. Its armor is thin, around 12 millimeters in places, enough to stop small arms fire and fragments, but not enough to save the crew from heavy weapons at close range. Its turret carries a 90-millimeter low-pressure gun. That gun is the reason the Eland matters. Across the river, partly hidden in the bush, sits a Soviet-designed T-34-85 tank. The T-34 had helped carry the Red Army into Berlin in 1945. It was old by 1975, but it was still a real tank. It weighed more than 30 tons. It carried an 85-millimeter cannon. It had armor many times thicker than the little South African armored car facing it. On paper, this should not be a fair fight. But the Eland does not need to out-armor the tank. It only needs one clear shot. The gunner lays the sight. The commander gives the order. The Eland fires. The 90-millimeter shape charge round strikes the tank. In South African accounts of the campaign, Elands knocked out Soviet-designed armor in exactly this kind of encounter. Some later tellings describe T-34 turrets being blown clear of their hulls, the kind of violent image soldiers remember for the rest of their lives. Whether every dramatic detail happened exactly as later stories told, it is difficult to prove. What is not in doubt is the result. A 6-ton wheeled armored car could kill a 30-ton tank, and in Angola it did. To understand how that was possible, you have to go back to the early 1960s. Before the war, before the mandatory arms embargo, before South Africa had fully learned how isolated it was going to become. At the end of the 1950s, the South African Defense Force still relied heavily on old British vehicles, including Daimler Ferret scout cars. They were useful for patrols and reconnaissance, but they were lightly armed and increasingly obsolete. South African planners understood something important about their future wars. They were unlikely to fight across the plains of Europe. They would fight across the vast distances of southern Africa, a desert, bush, bad roads, long supply lines, heat, dust, river crossings. A vehicle did not need to be the heaviest thing on the battlefield. It needed to move, it needed range, it needed a gun powerful enough to threaten what it met, and it needed to survive in a climate that punished machines as much as men. 3 foreign designs were considered: the British Alvis Saladin, the French Panhard EBR, and the smaller, lighter Panhard AML, the AML-1. In 1961, South African Defense Minister Jim Fouché and senior military officials negotiated with Panhard in France. South Africa bought complete vehicles and, more importantly, secured the right to build licensed versions at home. That timing was critical. In 1963, the United Nations Security Council called for a voluntary arms embargo against South Africa. In 1970, the pressure increased. In 1977, the embargo became mandatory under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. By then, South Africa already had the license, the drawings, the components, and the beginning of a domestic production line. If the agreement had come a few years later, the eland might never have existed. The work went to Sandok Austral, with production connected to South African industrial sites such as Boksburg and Durban. The first locally assembled vehicles were not a triumph. They were a failure. The early elands did not meet the required standard. The tolerances were wrong. The workmanship was not good enough. The vehicles had to be taken apart, studied, corrected, and rebuilt. At the time, it must have looked embarrassing. In hindsight, it may have been one of the most important moments in South African military-industrial history, because the engineers who disassembled those vehicles learned them completely. They learned what the French design did well. They learned what did not work in African conditions. They learned which parts could be made locally. They learned which systems had to be redesigned. Slowly, the eland stopped being simply a French design built in South Africa. It became a South African vehicle. The most important change was the engine. The original Panhard AML used an air-cooled French engine. It was compact and suitable for Europe, but African heat and dust exposed its weaknesses. Overheating became a serious problem. South African engineers replaced it with a locally available Chevrolet 153 four-cylinder petrol engine built through General Motors, South Africa. It was not elegant. It was practical. To make it fit, the rear of the vehicle had to be redesigned. The engine was mounted so it could be removed quickly in the field. Crews and mechanics valued that more than any theoretical perfection. If a vehicle broke down deep in Angola, it was not just a mechanical problem. It could become a death sentence. By the mid-1970s, the eland had become one of the core armored vehicles of the South African Defense Force. It was still light, it was still cramped, it still carried too little ammunition. It was not a tank. But it was fast. It was simple. It could travel long distances, and its 90-millimeter gun gave it a punch far beyond what its size suggested. Then Angola collapsed into war. In April 1974, Portuguese army officers overthrew the dictatorship in Lisbon during the Carnation Revolution. Portugal quickly began withdrawing from its African colonies. Angola, after centuries of colonial rule, was left with no peaceful transfer of power. Three main movements fought for control: the MPLA, backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba; the FNLA, backed by Zaire and, for a time, covertly supported by the United States; UNITA, based largely in the South and later supported by South Africa and the United States. By late 1975, Angola was no longer just a civil war. It was a Cold War battlefield. Cuba launched Operation Carlota and began sending troops to support the MPLA. Over the following years, Cuban numbers in Angola would rise dramatically, eventually reaching tens of thousands. South Africa intervened from the south. The intervention was called Operation Savannah. In October 1975, South African columns crossed from southwest Africa, modern Namibia, into Angola. The soldiers wore unmarked uniforms or operated under conditions of official denial. Pretoria did not want to admit the full scale of what it was doing. The mission was to support anti-MPLA forces, push north, and change the outcome before the MPLA consolidated control of Luanda. For the young men in the elands, the politics were distant. The road was immediate. They drove with poor maps, sometimes civilian maps, sometimes improvised information, often moving through terrain no one had properly surveyed for military use. Task Force Zulu crossed the Canine River on the 14th of October 1975. It moved fast, very fast. In just over a month, it drove thousands of kilometers, fought multiple engagements, and advanced deep into Angola. The speed of the South African armored cars frustrated opposing forces, including Cuban and MPLA commanders who had heavier weapons but often struggled to bring them to bear against such mobile columns. That was where the eland was at its best. Not in a frontal assault, and not in a fixed battle, but moving and striking, disappearing. At Katanga in early November 1975, South African armored cars fought one of the early armor engagements of the war. For many of the crews, this was the first time they fired live rounds at enemy vehicles. The training range theory became real in seconds. The 90-millimeter gun, firing shaped charge ammunition, could destroy armored personnel carriers and older tanks if the crew got a good shot. The little vehicle's weakness was also its strength. It could not trade blows. It had to shoot first, move fast, and avoid being caught. For a while, that worked. Then came Ebo. On the 23rd of November 1975, Battle Group Foxbat, commanded by Captain Johann Holm, approached a crossing near the Mabasa River outside Ebo. The bridge had been destroyed. Engineers would have to repair or replace it. South African forces moved forward to secure the area. But Cuban and MPLA forces had prepared the ground. They had watched the road. They had chosen their firing positions. Recoilless rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and rocket artillery were positioned to hit the South African column as it emerged. The lead elands entered the killing ground. The ambush opened. In the first minutes, vehicles were hit at close range. Thin armor that had been acceptable in reconnaissance was useless against anti-tank weapons. Mortar crews and support troops were caught in the open. South African casualties mounted quickly. Captain Holm was killed while trying to direct the withdrawal. Several elands were destroyed, damaged, or abandoned. 2 were captured intact and later displayed by Angolan and Cuban forces. The exact numbers vary between accounts, but the meaning of the battle does not. Abo was a disaster, not because the eland was a bad vehicle, because it was used in the wrong way. It was a reconnaissance car, not a breakthrough tank. It was never meant to lead a force into a prepared ambush across predictable ground against enemies who had already ranged their weapons. The crews paid for that lesson. One of the most remembered stories from Ebo concerns Lieutenant Johan du Toit. According to South African accounts, he survived inside a wrecked vehicle and later escaped on foot, walking for hours before reaching friendly forces. Whether every detail of every battlefield story has grown in the telling, the core truth remains. Abo became one of the darkest days for South African armored troops in the border war. 19 days later, South African forces returned to the same general area. This time, they came prepared. Artillery supported the assault. Engineers worked under fire. Elands crossed the rebuilt bridge, but they were no longer being thrown blindly into the same trap. During the fighting around what became known as Bridge 14, South African accounts describe eland crews knocking out enemy vehicles and using their mobility to exploit confusion. One often retold story describes a Soviet-built truck carrying Cuban soldiers accidentally approaching behind a South African eland, apparently mistaking it for part of its own column in the dust and smoke. The eland let the truck pass, then destroyed it from the rear. Another story from Bridge 14 belongs to Sergeant Danny Roxo. Roxo was not like the teenage national servicemen around him. He was older, Portuguese-born, and had fought before as part of the Portuguese counterinsurgency world in Africa. During the fighting, he was sent forward to reconnoiter and returned after killing enemy soldiers in close combat. For his actions, he received the honoris crux. In the language of official citations, the act sounds controlled and clean. In reality, it must have been brutal. And Bridge 14 showed the difference between using the eland badly and using it well. At Ebo, it had been sent into prepared fire. At Bridge 14, it was used with artillery, reconnaissance, and better awareness of the enemy. The vehicle had not changed, and the tactics had. By December 1975, South African forces had advanced far into Angola, but the political ground beneath the operation was collapsing. In Washington, the United States Congress moved to stop covert American involvement in the Angolan War. The Clark Amendment cut off covert aid to Angolan factions. South Africa had acted partly under the belief that American support would continue. It did not. Pretoria decided to withdraw. By March 1976, South African forces had pulled out of Angola. Operation Savannah had achieved tactical successes, but strategically it failed to stop the MPLA from holding Luanda and becoming the recognized government of Angola. The eland had proved itself as a weapon, but weapons do not decide wars by themselves. Angola remained at war. The MPLA held power. Cuban forces stayed. Soviet support continued. UNITA fought on. South Africa continued to operate along the border and inside Angola in different forms for years. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, the South African Army studied the lessons of Savannah. The eland had strengths. It was fast. It was small. It was easy to maintain. Its gun was dangerous. It had also had serious limits. It was cramped. It carried only 29 rounds. Its armor was thin. Its petrol engine made it vulnerable to fire. It could not withstand heavy weapons. And newer Soviet tanks were appearing in the region. South Africa began relying more on other vehicles, especially the Ratel 90, a larger six-wheeled infantry combat vehicle that mounted a similar 90mm gun but carried more men, more ammunition, and had better operational range. Still, the eland was not finished. In August 1981, South Africa launched Operation Protea. This was one of the largest South African mechanized operations since the Second World War. The target was the MPLA and SWAPO military infrastructure in southern Angola, including Jangongo and Ongiva. At Zangongo, South African forces encountered older Soviet-designed armor, including T-34 tanks used in defensive positions. Here, once again, the eland was dangerous. Against dug-in T-34s, especially when attacking from unexpected directions, the eland 90 could strike before the tanks could respond effectively. South African accounts describe T-34s being knocked out quickly by eland fire. The image was unforgettable. A small wheeled armored car racing forward, stopping just long enough to fire, then watching an old Soviet tank burn. This was what the eland did best. It exploited surprise. It exploited speed. It punished slower enemies who were looking the wrong way. Operation Protea was a major South African tactical success. Large amounts of Soviet-supplied equipment were captured, including tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, trucks, and communications gear. South African casualties were relatively low compared with the losses inflicted. And in the aftermath, South African forces captured something politically important: a Soviet soldier. His name was Nikolai Fyodorovich Pestretsov. He was a Soviet warrant officer serving as an advisor in Angola. His capture publicly exposed the direct presence of Soviet military personnel in the conflict, something Moscow had often preferred to keep vague or deny. His wife, Galina, was killed during the fighting. And this is one of the details that changes the shape of the story. Because the Angolan War was not just a map of arrows, vehicles, and operations. It was also men and women sent far from home by governments that described their missions as necessary. South African conscripts, Cuban internationalists, Angolan soldiers, Soviet advisors, Namibian guerrillas, and Portuguese veterans. People who often understood only a small piece of the machine they were inside. The eland's story also traveled beyond Angola. South African-built elands appeared in Morocco's war against the Polisario Front in Western Sahara. In 1979, Polisario forces captured a number of Moroccan-operated elands during an ambush. Photographs of captured vehicles became embarrassing evidence of where South African weapons had gone. Some reportedly still carried Afrikaans markings. A vehicle born from South Africa's isolation had become part of another African war. By the early 1980s, there was an irony in the eland's development. The South African version had evolved so far from the original French AML that South African components were valued in their own right. The licensee had improved and adapted the vehicle to the point where, in some respects, it had become better suited to hard African service than the design it came from. But technology was moving. The eland was not moving fast enough. In December 1983, during Operation Askari, South African forces around Kuvalai encountered a more dangerous enemy than the old T-34. T-54s and T-55s. These were newer Soviet main battle tanks with thicker sloped armor and powerful 100mm guns. Against them, the Eland was badly outmatched. On paper, the 90mm shaped charge round could penetrate impressive armor. But war does not happen on paper. At night, in dust and confusion, against moving tanks with limited ammunition and thin armor, theory became less useful. Some rounds failed to achieve decisive results. Some struck at poor angles. Some crews ran low on ammunition before the threat was gone. And unlike the T-34s caught by surprise at Zangongo, T-54s and T-55s could shoot back with weapons that could destroy an eland at almost any practical range. Kuvalai exposed the truth. The eland had been brilliant in the right conditions, but it was not a tank destroyer for the modern battlefield. After Askari, South African doctrine increasingly shifted the anti-armor role to better platforms. The Ratel 90, anti-tank guided missiles, and, when necessary, Oliphant main battle tanks. The eland returned to the work it had always been best suited for: reconnaissance, and patrols, convoy escort, screening, ambushes, fast movement across dangerous ground. It was no longer the vehicle South Africa wanted at the front of a tank fight. But it was still useful. Older soldiers trusted it. Young soldiers learned in it. Mechanics knew how to keep it alive. In the bush, a simple machine could sometimes do what a more advanced machine could not. In October 1987, South African elands were still being used in ambushes and patrol actions in southern Angola. Against armored personnel carriers, trucks, and lightly protected columns, the eland remained dangerous. That was the strange arc of the vehicle. In 1963, South African engineers had struggled to build it properly. In 1975, it had raced deep into Angola. In 1981, it had helped destroy older Soviet-designed armor. In 1983, it had met modern tanks and shown its age. And in 1987, it was still burning vehicles in the bush. But the war was changing in a way no armored car could solve. By 1987 and 1988, the fighting in Angola had escalated sharply. Cuban troop levels rose. Soviet-supplied aircraft became more active. MiG-23 fighter bombers challenged South African forces from the air. Surface-to-air missiles made air operations more dangerous. For years, South Africa had often relied on mobility, artillery, and air support to offset numbers. Now the air situation was shifting. On the 27th of June, 1988, Cuban MiG-23s struck the Kaluek Dam area near the Angola-Namibia border. South African forces were present around the dam, including light vehicles. The airstrike killed 11 South African soldiers. One eland was hit, killing its crew. There was nothing the little armored car could do. Its gun was meant for vehicles and field targets. Its armor was meant for bullets and fragments. Its doctrine was built around movement, concealment, and speed. None of that mattered when bombs came from fast jets overhead. The eland's battlefield world had changed. And on the same day as the Kaluek strike, negotiations involving South Africa, Angola, and Cuba were moving forward internationally. The war was approaching its end, not because one side had achieved a clean victory, but because the military, political, and economic costs had become too heavy. In December 1988, the tripartite accord was signed. Cuban troops would withdraw from Angola. South Africa would withdraw from its military involvement and accept the process leading to Namibian independence. Namibia became independent in 1990. South Africa itself changed soon after. In 1994, the country held its first fully democratic election. Nelson Mandela became president. The apartheid state that had built the eland sent it into Angola and used it in wars against liberation movements ceased to exist. The old South African Defense Force became part of the new South African National Defense Force. Former enemies were integrated into the same military structure. Men who had once fought each other now wore the same uniform. The eland was gradually retired from frontline service. It was replaced by newer vehicles, especially the Ruikat. The Ruikat was larger, heavier, faster over long distances, and far more advanced. It had 8 wheels, a stabilized 76mm high-velocity gun, better optics, and the ability to fire accurately on the move. By every modern technical measure, it was superior. But the eland had one advantage that larger vehicles struggled to match. It was small. It was light. It could be transported more easily. It could disappear into terrain where bigger vehicles stood out. And in some corners of Africa, long after its official retirement, elands or eland-derived vehicles continued to appear in service with other armies, security forces, and private operators. Old weapons rarely vanish when wars end. They move. They are sold. They are stored. They are reactivated. They turn up in places their designers never imagined. That is part of the eland's legacy. But there is another part, and it cannot be ignored. The eland was an impressive piece of military engineering. It was built by a country cut off from most conventional arms suppliers and forced to develop a domestic arms industry under pressure. South African engineers adapted a foreign design, solved real mechanical problems, localized production, improved the vehicle, and made it work in some of the harshest combat conditions on Earth. That achievement is real, but so is the purpose it served. The eland fought for the armed forces of an apartheid state. It was used in wars connected to South Africa's effort to preserve its regional power, fight liberation movements, and maintain control over Southwest Africa, now Namibia. It was part of a military system defending a political order built on racial exclusion and repression. And most of the young crews did not design that system. Many were conscripts. They were told where to go. They were told what the enemy was. They obeyed orders, protected their friends, and tried to survive. Some acted bravely. Some died terribly. But bravery at the level of the soldier does not erase the politics of the war. The honest history has to hold both truths at once. The eland was a remarkable machine, and it served a deeply unjust state. It was an engineering success, and it belonged to a morally compromised war. It saved some crews. It killed many enemies. It failed when misused. It became obsolete when the battlefield changed. That is why the story matters. Not because the eland was invincible. It was not. Not because it worked every time it mattered. It did not. At Ibo, it was destroyed in a prepared ambush. At Kuvalai, it struggled against T-54s and T-55s. At Kaliwek, it had no answer to aircraft overhead. The eland's real story is more interesting than a legend of invincibility. It worked when used for the job it was built to do. It failed when commanders asked it to be something it was not. It was a scout car that sometimes killed tanks, a light armored vehicle that became a symbol of mobility, A small machine that showed how far adaptation could go and where adaptation finally reached its limit. Today, surviving elands can still be seen in museums and collections. Some are preserved in South Africa. Others remain as relics in Angola, Morocco, and elsewhere, reminders of wars that shaped southern Africa but are still poorly understood outside the region. If you stand beside one, the first thing you notice is how small it is. It does not look like a legend. It looks cramped, thin, almost fragile. You can imagine 3 young men inside it, sweating in the heat, listening to the engine, watching the bush through narrow vision blocks, knowing that if they saw the enemy first, they might live. If they did not, they might never get out. That is the real eland, not a miracle weapon, not a myth. A 6-ton armored car with a gun too large for its body, built by engineers who had no choice but to make it work, driven by young men sent into a war their country would later struggle to explain. On a riverbank in Angola, it could kill a T-34. In a prepared ambush, it could burn like anything else. Against a MiG-23, it was helpless. And somewhere between those truths is the history of the naughty car, a machine that was never supposed to matter, but did.